Don't wait until you have the fully optimized, manufacturable, serviceable product before you start getting that crucial early customer feedback.
Have you ever tried to build an MVP in the medical device space only to realize that what you heard about building an MVP mostly comes from building software and doesn't really apply? Welcome to LifeSci Continuum. Today, I speak with Russ Singleton and Aaron Joseph. We break down exactly what an MVP really means in regulated markets.
I know that there's lots of regulatory landmines, and once you have established a certain pathway and a certain description and categorization of your product, which is your MVP, you could be making it very difficult to then follow it up with the full commercial product.
Why early versions are supposed to be somewhat expensive and probably a bit imperfect, and how to use early customer installs and even pre-MVP first-in-human systems to learn faster without blowing yourself up.
In my experience, it's sort of like uncovering things that I didn't even know about, and we certainly learned a lot in those situations.
All right, let's go. All right, guys, welcome back to the show. Appreciate having you back on.
Hello, Bill. Thanks for having us.
We're glad to be here.
We've been talking a little bit, and the subject of developing an MVP in the medical device space has come up quite a bit. So wanted to talk more about that during this episode. I don't know that an exact MVP is clearly defined in the space, and it probably means different things to different people. So, why don't we start quickly with just an idea generally of what an MVP would look like?
So I could start. This is a case that I mentioned to Aaron a little earlier. It's not exactly medical device in my experience, but it is capital equipment, very complex. I had an experience in a company where we were developing DNA sequencing back in the days when it was first being developed. And we had a capillary electrophoresis, multiple capillary technology that we wanted to get out, and we didn't know if it was going to work in the field. So we ended up deciding to go out fast with a complete system built like a tank and safe, and to be able to get the feedback from our early lab customers. And we built 7 of them deliberately, not manufacturable, but supportable. We had a whole product team to support them and get it out in the field. So I would definitely call that an MVP in the sense it was a minimum viable way to get feedback out in the field in a complex device. And it worked really well for us. We got a lot of feedback and was able to take it back and then iterate that back into the product development process.
What about that briefly made it an MVP for you?
It was a technology that we needed to test chemistry and test the technology for being able to find bases, if you know genetics, and how well it worked and how accurate it worked in the field for real customers. And we were able to get that feedback. So we were testing out the technology concepts in a live environment. So that was why it was important for us to get it out in the field. We couldn't just do that in the lab. We needed to do that in the hands of real lab customers for what we were trying to do.
And I was just going to say, I think what's key in what Russ is saying is the customer feedback. So no matter how much testing you do internally, even if you bring in sort of representative customers for usability studies or customer evaluation, it's not the same as them having the new product, on their site, especially if it's something, let's say interventional used in an OR. And what the MVP strategy is about is getting that crucial feedback from early customers earlier. Don't wait until you have the fully optimized, manufacturable, serviceable product before you start getting that crucial early customer feedback. Now, the challenge is that for medical devices being regulated is that it raises the bar to get that product out initially. And as Russ was saying, it has to be safe and reliable. You also will need regulatory approval of it. So you're investing a lot into an MVP that will not be profitable. And so that's part of the mix. And I've heard from people in medical device companies that say, we're FDA regulated, so there's no such thing as an MVP. but it's just an MVP modified for a regulated industry.
I do have an example of a situation in a medical device. So the story is for a surgical robotics company that I was part of, a startup. And I came in as an outsider into the company. The company had been going on for a few years and they were having trouble getting the product out the door. So I brought a technique into the company. I took over R&D coming into the company as an outsider. And I got the team to focus on just the bare minimum of what they thought they needed to get out to the field. So that's a concept of MVP. And paying attention to safety, paying attention that we were going into a regulated environment. We went to Europe at the time. I don't think you can do that quite so much anymore. And get it out. And we missed a few things that we knew were part of the product, but we just decided to get the key things out there and make sure it was safe and get into hands of customers. And we put it in a number of sites in Europe and got a ton of feedback as a result of it. And also because we had a camera on board, we were able to make videos of the surgeries that we were doing and use it for the actual FDA submission that we did successfully, actually. So that was a good situation for us, but it wasn't intentional in the sense that it was, it was a diversion from the original plan. It was like in the case of one situation, just if I'm going to make a choice between the heart and the lungs and the brain, what am I going to keep in to the product and what am I going to not have in it? So it's really hard choices.
So a couple things there. I want to bounce back to Aaron for a moment, but Russell, we'll come back to what you just said in a second. But Aaron, you had said, okay, you'll know that this product won't be profitable. So you're going to be investing in this and you just know it. Talk to me about that, because I think a lot of people will hear that and be like, I can't work on something that isn't going to be profitable. So explain that a little bit more, what you meant by that and what it looks like.
Yeah, exactly. And the business considerations and business strategy are going to be important. And an MVP strategy is not appropriate for everybody. If you're launching version 2 of a product that's already out there, or it's a well-known type of category of medical device, then an MVP may not really buy you much. But if you're developing a truly innovative device, then what you're doing is balancing the time and investment to get the MVP out there, get that crucial customer feedback, and then do a fast follow-up with the quote-unquote real product, the one that you want to manufacture, the one that you want to sell everywhere, the one that's going to disrupt the market. That may not be a positive balance for all products. And so there's no way to say, oh, you should always do an MVP. Maybe in an unregulated market, that's a very different equation. But for medical devices, it's how crucial is that early customer feedback, and what is your time span for the product? Now, a lot of medical devices are out on the market for 8, 10, 12 years without any changes. So we're talking, a long product life cycle and long-term strategies. The other thing to consider is that for a truly innovative device, the company may need to develop a lot of infrastructure around it. And it's not just manufacturing. It can be a trained sales force, a customer support team, field service engineers, all of them. And all of that infrastructure needs to be in place for widespread, full production product. So the MVP can also give space for all that infrastructure to be developed, because it's very hard to do that rapidly.
Russell, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that the thinking of the cost structure of an MVP is usually higher than what you want it to be for a final product. Certainly, you haven't worked all the problems out for manufacturing if you're going to put a number of these things out in the field. I agree with Aaron that you need to have the field support ready for it, even in a limited situation for the sites that you go in. And in my experience, it's almost like a site-by-site thinking process of what support you will have in place. And also from a sales perspective, it's a selling process of getting those customers lined up to know that they're not going to have the final product. You're going to guarantee them that they will get the upgrades when you have it. So it costs the company money. They're going out knowing they're going to put out at least 2, maybe more of these units. as fast follow-ons to solve the problems for the customers. You have to build that into, if you're a startup, the proposal that you put in front of the VCs or the angel funders or whoever's funding this kind of thing. But the value of it is you get a ton of value from the early feedback, and you make discoveries that you didn't even think about in my experience. It's sort of like uncovering things that I didn't even know about what you needed to do in that situation. And we certainly learned a lot in those situations.
Right. It gives you a chance to think about and incorporate the things that you didn't think about, you couldn't plan for. Some of the unintended consequences of how your device might be used.
I'll just interrupt here to say that it's also a matter of like a resonance between an innovative new technology and the clinicians who are going to make use of it. And if it's truly innovative, then they've never used it before. Henry Ford was famous for saying, my customers just asked for a faster horse. They didn't know what a car was. And in many aspects of healthcare, there is, a change from a horse-drawn cart to an automobile. And it can have huge effects that you won't know until you put that new medical device in the hands of the clinicians.
Right. And I think before, when we were talking earlier, you had mentioned, I think, the Da Vinci product. And did you want to use that kind of to illustrate some of this? You want to share that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a famous history of the beginning of intuitive surgical and the Da Vinci system, and this is 25 years ago, that it was originally intended for cardiac surgery, which is a really tough market. As you can imagine, the risks there are very high. Surgeons are very conservative. A very inventive and resourceful urologist tried it for prostatectomy, for prostate surgery, and it turned out to be a perfect fit for urology. And that was the beginning of all the growth for the company. If you look at that from an MVP strategy, they would not have known that surgical system, that robotic system, was such a good fit for urology until it was actually tried. Urologists weren't asking for a robot.
Fill in some of the gaps for me on the story and how kind of the MVP story played out. Did they initially design and build one robot and then maybe source it around to cardiologists and then get a lot of pushback? Or how did that happen or unfold?
Unfortunately, I don't know all the details. That was long before I joined the company.
Okay.
But I'm sure you can look up the history. Perhaps it's even on the Intuitive's website. But the key thing was that the very smart people had designed a really revolutionary new medical device, this surgical robot, and they weren't sure what instruments it needed or exactly what it needed to do. And if you're just focused on cardiac surgery, as I said, it's a very high bar. And it would have been a very difficult place to get started. The urology market turned out to be a perfect fit, and it has to do with the geometry of the surgery. But I'll just say, for any men out there my age and older, if you need prostate surgery, you want it done with a surgical robotic system. The advantage for the company is that they didn't try to make a zillion robots and place them everywhere. The capital expense is enormous, but also all the infrastructure around it is enormous. And you have to develop special instruments for each medical application. So you want to know, what's a really good fit and focus on that and make it work really well before you spread out to other applications. Coincidentally, this week, the Medtronic surgical robot, Hugo, was just approved by FDA for the US market for urology. So they are, and I'm sure they will rapidly follow up with many other applications, but they're starting with that base focus, make sure that works well in the US market, and then build on it. That's not strictly an MVP strategy, but it uses the same principles. You're getting that key customer feedback. You're also building up your infrastructure to support that new product.
Bouncing back to something that Russell said a few minutes ago, he said you have to be able to communicate to sort of these early users that you're getting feedback from, that they just aren't getting the finished final product.
Yeah.
How do you think you approach somebody with that? Any strategies or thoughts around going to somebody who's used to finished approved product?
So this approach we actually did put in place at the outset with the company. We decided that for the first 2 years, we said all customers who get our products will get automatic free upgrades, including full replacement if necessary, which is a very expensive strategy in some cases. You approach the customer and say, there's no risk to you from a financial perspective. And then we will have the support in place for you when you have the robot in place, if you have any situations where you need to do that. And we had the engineering team as well, besides the support team. If something drastic happened in the field, we would fly out. We went to Brussels first, in Germany. I mean, we were overseas doing this kind of thing. So it got pretty expensive when we were doing that. I would say that we got some early feedback very quickly. For example, in our vision system, that we were seeing things that we didn't expect to see, that we could make changes with pretty quickly, and say, oh, I know what that is. And we made the changes, and it was very dramatic for the customers to be able to get that fixed. So they were very happy with the speed of addressing the issues, if you will, with the feedback that we had.
Right.
And we discovered several major things that took a little longer to solve. Some electrical problems, for example. But because we were in the field, we said, gee, we didn't even think about that. That was a new type of problem that we had that was if we had known about it, we could probably have done it if we had been through placing surgical robots in the field before in another company, which we were one of the early companies, we might have solved it. But going in the field, we were able to get the feedback right away and use that to do a fast follow-on to that.
Right. Thinking about this whole structure, I mean, we're clearly we've gone through the FDA process at this point with whatever state the product's in to get it to that initial MVP. But even before that, that's still a heavy lift. And we talked a little bit before the call about a pre-MVP MVP.
I'll just chime in on that one. So for products that require a clinical study for FDA approval or other regulatory approval, the company has a choice of what the product is that's used in the clinical trial. And when I say a choice, the obvious choice is the final finished product. But as you get into devices that have more software, capital equipment, it becomes more advantageous to have a first-in-human system and then followed by a commercial system. So that's the what you're referring to as the pre-MVP. It is pre-market, but it's an important strategy because you're not waiting to start your clinical trial until you have the complete, finished, polished product. You're also able to work on that full commercial product in parallel with your clinical trial. So from a project management standpoint and sort of resource allocation, it's advantageous. It also means that whatever you learn in the clinical trial gets folded back into your final product. And that can be enhancements to the UI. It could be something about, as Russ was saying, it could be some additional feature, an automatic report generation that no one ever thought was needed, no one ever thought of. And this first-in-human system, it then is an early indicator of what customers are going to need. So it gets you sort of the pre-MVP benefits.
What do you think are the minimum requirements of that pre-MVP first-in-human? What do you have to nail there or include at that point that just can't wait until that second round?
It's safety considerations for sure. Yeah. You've got to think about hardware, software, whatever it is, and the most ridiculous situations that might come up to make sure that you're ensuring it's safe for the patient going in and being able to recover it, power going out, or whatever the situation may be. And that was a big deal for us because we had to think of things and say, oh my gosh, I didn't think of that. We had to put that in place. That is absolutely key. The other thing is, I think you have to think about the situation for the customer's particular surgeries that you're going in. So if you're doing an MVP, you're likely, or you should, have picked out the customers that you're going to do this with. So you know the kinds of things that they're interested in. They may not be in the sweet spot of what you're trying to do for the broad market, but you want to make sure that you're handling their situation in their case, and make sure you have those features in place. So I would say those two things.
And I'll also add that the system is reliable enough that it doesn't interrupt clinical operations. And that sounds obvious,
Right.
but I have seen cases where companies started a clinical trial with a device that either the software crashed or there were electronic glitches, and you could say it's like, oh well, just needs to get through the clinical trial, but you're asking a lot of the clinicians and everyone else involved in that clinical trial to put up with that sort of thing. So
Right.
you can do without the bells and whistles. You can do without the manufacturability. I'm sure if there's any manufacturing engineers listening, they're kind of cringing right now. But remember, we're trading off the importance of the feedback from the clinical trial and of course the evidence from the clinical trial with completing the perfect commercial launch product. And yes, as Russ said, safety is first and foremost, and effectiveness, because you're doing a clinical trial. But there's also a certain level of reliability and functionality. So if you have a really awkward UI, it just isn't going to work well.
And thinking through some of the implications of this and thinking through my regulatory strategy and where that lives in all of this. And for some people, I'm not thinking about that till months down the road, but I think the two of you are more advocates for thinking about that very, very early on. Well, Russell, Aaron, thank you so much for being on today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
If you made it here, thank you. If you haven't already, like, share, and subscribe to the channel. If you want to learn more about this topic, I expand on it below, as well as in my LinkedIn newsletter. That's all for now. More soon.